have
Yeah.
we often will have our the big heater thing, and she's like right next to it, and everyone else would be sitting like way far away.
Okay.
She's good with just her sweat.
That's good. All right. Today is kind of momentous. Not only is it our 10th anniversary, it's also the last sermon in our whole summer-long series on the story of God. So we've been covering over this summer the story of the Bible from beginning to end. We've had to cut out quite a few very important things. I've tried to work them in there quickly. But what we've really been telling is the story of God, which is what the Bible is. It's the story of us and God together, but primarily it's God's story. And today we're going to look at the very last chapter of that story, and almost the very last book in the very last chapter in the last book. This is a little bit different in that everything we've said in the story up to this point all happened in the past. And while what we're going to talk about tonight was written in the past, it's talking about what is still yet to come, something in the future. Last week we talked about the conversion of Paul, but we also said that the story of the church that starts at Pentecost, that really ramps up with Paul's conversion and spreads across the world, that story is our story. That's where we fit into the story. God's story meets our story in the church, in this really long chapter of God's story, where the word is being spread, where we are part of God's activity. We continue to be the body of Christ, to live out the story and bring the presence of God to the world. And so if this were any other story, this would be where it would end. Most stories end before, or at the very least at the point where you get to the present day, right? Because you can't tell the story any further than that. But because this is not just any story, and it's not the story of God's people, it's not our story, it's God's story. And because it's God's story, we know the ending. God's given us the ending. And so even though the story is still going on, we don't have to worry about how it ends. And so it's to that ending that we turn when we turn to the book of Revelation. Now, the Revelation of John is, without a doubt, the most confusing, frightening, misunderstood, misapplied book in the Bible. Some people don't understand it and they just stay away from it. And I admit that I'm usually in that category. I just don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Others think they understand it so well that they don't read almost anything else. And they're like sure that they know what's happening next. The book of Revelation has been so divisive from the moment it was written that it took over 300 years for the church to come to the agreement that this was an inspired book, that it belonged in the Bible. This was the last book to be added to the canon officially, our scriptures. And that's also, it's not the only reason it's at the end, but it's sort of that book that sort of some churches were using it, others weren't, and it took time for the Spirit to reveal, no, this is something I want to be in the Bible. This is an inspired book. So it's very, very confusing. I'm saying that up front. If you've never read Revelation or you don't know what I'm talking about, open it up sometime and just glance through a chapter and then you'll have an understanding of why I'm talking about it. It's so confusing. There's so much stuff. There's imagery of beasts and dragons and two messengers who get slayed by fire. All this kinds of crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense on its surface. Now tonight we're only going to look at a small part of Revelation. We're not going to try to answer all of the questions, the confusing parts. But before I speak about our passage tonight, I do actually want to address this stigma around Revelation, because it's full of good stuff, even if it can be confusing. And what kind of pastor would I be if I told you to not read something in the Bible? If I said, oh, just skip that part. So I want to talk about what kind of book Revelation is, so that we have a better understanding. We can go to it and be a little bit less afraid of it, a little bit less confused. First, what kind of book is Revelation? Partly, it's an epistle. It's a letter, right? It's technically framed as a vision that John sees and then letters that he's writing to 7 churches. But primarily, the book is what's called apocalyptic literature. In the days of Jesus and earlier, in Jewish literature before that, there was a particular type of Jewish writing known as apocalyptic literature, which focused on visions from angels or from God. The word apocalypse we tend to associate with the end of the world. The word itself actually just means something revealed or revelation. It's just a translation of the book of Revelation. It's been associated with the end of the world because the book of Revelation seems to be about the end of the world. But apocalyptic just means something that has been revealed that we could not have learned any other way but from being revealed. It's not something self-evident. So, apocalyptic literature tends to be full of poetic imagery, allusions, intentionally obscure language and metaphors, because it's trying to convey something that's not possible to understand without the help of supernatural revelation, of special revelation. John's Revelation is not the only apocalyptic literature in the Bible. We tend to think of it that way, but there's parts of the book of Daniel, some of the other prophets in the Old Testament that are somewhat apocalyptic as well. So while the book of Revelation is unique and weird, it does belong to a type of writing, and knowing what type of writing it is can help us ease some of the burden of reading it, of approaching it with fear. Now, just because it's apocalyptic, because it's full of this obscure imagery and poetic language and all that, doesn't mean that nothing in it should be taken seriously. Before we get to the actual passage, I want to give you, and I promise this is the last, really heady academic thing I'm going to do in the sermon. Before we get there, I want to give you 4 main ways that it's possible to read Revelation. So I'm going to go through them very, very quickly, but there's 4 different ways that people have thought to read this book. And again, I want to tell you this because I think we're used to just sort of being like, I don't know how to read this. I don't get it. So the most common reading in America is to read it literally, as it's all about the future, the end times. That's probably the one that if any of us have a general sense of how people read Revelation in America, they're all looking for prophecies, right? How is the world going to end? When is God coming back? All these sorts of things. So that's the first way, the most common way. I'm not sure it's the best way, but I think they all have their strengths and their weaknesses. So in that viewing of the book, everything in it is going to happen in the future. Nothing in Revelation has already happened. The second way, some people believe the exact opposite, that almost everything in Revelation happened during the time of John's life when he was writing it. That it was about what he was seeing around him, that it was coded language because you couldn't write about the Roman authorities outright and get away with it, not be punished. So he did it all in code. So that's the second one, that it's all old school and we have to decode it about the Roman Empire. Third, some kind of take a middle position that the prophecies in Revelation have been fulfilled throughout history, including up to the present time and beyond. So some of it is from the past, some of it is still in the future, some of it might be now. That's the third way. Fourth, and finally, that some say that Revelation is about spiritual warfare going on around us. And so the prophecies in Revelation aren't single events, but that they happen many times over in the course of history because they're about the spiritual warfare happening at all times around us. So, I apologize for getting academic. I wanted to put that out there because I feel, and I'm sure many of you do too, that Revelation is confusing and frustrating and scary. And I am trying to get less scared of Revelation, so I wanted to help you be a little bit less scared of it too. With that said, all of that, take it if it's helpful for you. I'm so glad, I'm so happy. It has almost nothing to do with our passage tonight, because the passage that we're reading from tonight usually doesn't need any of those interpretive lenses. This is one of the few passages that everybody agrees is about the future. It's so clear that it's about the future. It's not about now. It's not about the past. Revelation 21, 1 through 5, which is in your bulletins, or you could look it up on a Bible app or in your Bible if you brought one. Revelation chapter 21, 1 through 5, comes, like I said earlier, almost at the very end of the very last book in the Bible. This is essentially the message that God leaves us with as we finish reading God's story. This is the last thing that we get, essentially. So here we go, Revelation 21, 1 through 5. John is speaking. He says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." These 5 verses get to the heart of Revelation. All the other stuff aside, if there's only one thing that you should take away from this passage and all of Revelation, the whole book, it's this: the end of the story is not in doubt. God's story may be ongoing. There's going to be plenty of twists and turns along the way for us, for the world. I don't have any doubt about that. But the end of the story has already been written. Right now, the battle between sin and righteousness, between love and hate, between justice and injustice, that battle is still raging. But one side has already lost, and they just won't admit it yet. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Jesus' resurrection in the story. We said that the powers of sin and death were defeated that day, and it was true. And it is true. That was the day that they lost the war. But unfortunately, the battle is still going. And it will continue to do so until the end. But because we have a powerful and loving God, we know that when the end does come, whenever that might be, God will make his victory over sin complete. Revelation 21 tells us there will be no more death, no more mourning, crying, pain. The old order, the one we're still struggling against today, the order of sin and death, that old order is going to pass away and be forgotten. This passage tells us there is going to be a new heaven, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem that's going to come down from heaven. Usually we talk about going up to heaven when we die or in the end, but in Revelation it's really the other way around. Heaven comes to us. Without getting into unanswerable questions about the nature of the new heaven and earth, the important takeaway from that is that God will dwell in the midst of God's people. That's what he says in these verses. He will be in the midst of us, no longer separated from us. Ever since the beginning of humanity, from the beginning of the story when humanity chose sin, there has been a separation between us and God. But because of Jesus, because of the Lamb who was slain, that separation is gone. And when the end comes, we'll be able to stand in God's presence without fear. This morning during Sunday school, we had a couple of little kids, and we're doing this same story series in the morning. So I was talking about Revelation and the end in Sunday school. And one of the little kids, sort of jokingly, but maybe a little seriously too, started saying, I think hell would be more fun. In heaven, you have to follow God's rules. Sadly, I think we've done a pretty bad job over the years of making heaven seem like a worthwhile goal. Hell seems like a lot more fun. Heaven seems kind of stuck up and as if we have to just sort of, prim and proper, and we're on clouds playing harps and just, bowing down before God the whole time. I think that's our idea of heaven a little too often. And I get why that sounds boring. I love church. But if heaven was just a church service for the rest of eternity, I'd get bored too, if that's all it was. But that's not the picture of heaven that the Bible gives us. Heaven is certainly a place where we worship God all the time, because God will be right there among us. But worshiping God means more than just singing songs, bowing down before him. Worship is anything that we do for God and in God's presence that honors God. So sin is out, right? There's no murdering in heaven. If that's how you get your jollies, sorry, you're out. But you can worship God by working on something you're passionate about, or being creative, or sharing joyful laughter with friends. The image of heaven in Revelation 21 is of a new Jerusalem on a new earth. Jerusalem, both in the days when this was written and still now in some sense, is centered around the temple complex. That's sort of the focus of the city. It's at the top of a hill. Everything looks up to it. It's the place where God dwelt with his people, the temple. And that's still going to be true in the New Jerusalem. There won't be a temple where God's located, but the city is still going to center around God and his presence. That's still the focal point of everything we do. But just like in Jerusalem then, Jerusalem now, and the New Jerusalem in the future, there's other stuff to do. There's other stuff going on in the city. There's going to be a lot going on besides just worship. But it's all going to be centered on the presence of God among us. So next time you picture heaven, don't think of playing a harp on a cloud unless you really love clouds or harp playing, which is great if that's your thing. But imagine doing things you love, the things you love to do the most, that give you passion and energy in life, those hobbies or your job if you're lucky, those things that you love to do. And imagine doing those things for God and with God, right there alongside you. That's heaven. That's what the book of Revelation tells us heaven is. The book of Revelation, as I've said, can be a scary book because of the imagery of the dragons and the beasts and the fire and all of that, but also because it's complicated and confusing. Thankfully, no matter how difficult the book is to understand, there's one message that comes through really loud and clear. God's story has a happy ending. Revelation tells us that the God of love, the God who would die for us, is ultimately victorious over every evil, every sin and death, all of it in the world. And for those who persevere, those who worship the Lamb who was slain, we are assured that we will be present at the end of the story when sin and death pass away forever. And we can live and worship God in the presence of God forever. That is the joyous good news. That means we can live without fear of death or sin, without being held captive by fear of sin and death. Because we know those things are empty. They're empty powers, already defeated by Jesus. That's what knowing the end of the story gives us. The ability to let those things go, to be courageous in the face of those things that other people are afraid of. So let's celebrate that we worship a God who's already defeated those powers, who, as he says, is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, who was and is to come, the same God who loves us and who we know in Jesus Christ. Let's give thanks that that's how our story ends. And let's spend some time in prayer together.